Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly, as well as the vice president of policy for the American Society and the Council of the Americas. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. This conversation we're going to have today, it's taking place in corporate boardrooms, in government ministries, in think tanks, and so on, all across the Americas. And everywhere, it seems that the core question is the same, which is how should Latin America deal with these rising tensions between China and the United States? How will it affect trade flows? How will it affect investment? How will it affect supply chains, geopolitical alliances, and so much more? And ultimately, what should companies and governments do in response? Is it possible to try to balance both of these countries in what looks like an increasingly bipolar world, or will companies and governments and countries overall be forced at some level over time to choose? And I personally have been yearning for a long time now to hear an honest, direct conversation among big thinkers from different countries, from a variety of ideological viewpoints, to understand just where the debate stands, what people are thinking. So we put one together, and here we are. Today's event is public, on the record. It's being webcast. We're grateful to our friends at Florida International University for the support that helped make this event happen. So let's get to it. Let me introduce our panel. It's a great one. We're joined this morning by Martha Bárcena. Martha is the former ambassador of Mexico to the United States. Felipe Larraín, the former finance minister of Chile and now professor of economics at the Universidad Católica de Chile. And Fernando Mejía, who's the executive director of Fedesarrollo in Colombia. I believe strongly that the best events are real conversations, so I've asked our panelists to keep their answers short, maybe 2 to 3 minutes or so, and hopefully debate and maybe even disagree with each other. So let's go ahead and get started. And Martha, let me pose this question to you first. I think before we get into the prescriptive part of this discussion, I'd like to just start by describing the lay of the land a little bit. So what does this debate or conversation about the increasing tensions between China and the United States, what does it look and sound like in your home country today, in this case, obviously Mexico? How front of mind is this question amongst politicians, business leaders, and intellectuals? And if you can give us some sense of where the battle lines are, I mean, who is defending which point of view, and how concerned people are about what's happening. Thank you. Martha, I do believe you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Brian. It is a pleasure to be here with you, with Felipe, and with Fernando to discuss this very important issue. I must say, nevertheless, that in Mexico, the discussion on how to deal with the relations with China vis-a-vis the U.S. is not exactly at the top of the agenda. Why? I think it's pretty obvious, because at the top of the agenda is our relation with the U.S. itself and with the North American region as the most competitive region in the world. And it is in this second part that the debate regarding China takes place. When you say that the U.S.-Mexico relation is the most complex relationship in the world, it's an obvious saying, but what people sometimes do not understand, it's how deep this relation and this integration is, and how it doesn't deal many times with issues of foreign policy, but with issues of domestic policy for both countries. In the case of the border policies, migration, etc. And in that sense, the presence of China, or the relationship of China, it has a second level of discussion. The first level is how do we manage our relationship with the US, and in that context with Canada as a North American region. In the second part, which is it true that North America can continue to be the most competitive region in the world? when a statistic showed us that the North American region has been losing market share in the recent years, and also it's now being equalized by countries like China in technological matters, then it comes the discussion on how do we deal with China. And what we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic is that the North American region was too dependent on some elements of the supply chain from Asia and China in particular. And in that sense, the discussion of how Mexico should deal with the US and China takes place in the context of strengthening our the competitiveness of North America. Having said that, Mexico, as I wrote in my article, is considered by China as a Lao Peño, an old friend, because we were the second Latin American country to recognize them and to establish a good relationships with China. And we still have quite a good relationship with China. I will talk later on maybe on our trade relationship, basically, but we have a good political relationship with China in different fora, including the G20. So the discussion on how to deal with China, it is not on the first line of discussions in Mexico, but it is an important one related to the competitiveness of Mexico and North America. And I think the most difficult debate in the near future will be about the network of 5G, which one is going to be used in Mexico, and this is directly linked with a dialogue that we are already having with the US on cybersecurity and the clean internet. I will stop here to give more space for discussion later on, Brian.
Well, thank you, Martha, and yes, we'll definitely get to 5G, which I agree is a very key issue. Felipe, coming to you, Martha described a couple of reasons why this question might not be forefront on the radar in Mexico. My sense is that it's very prominent in the public debate in Chile. Can you talk to us a little bit about the debate that's happening there?
Sure, Brian. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with Martha and Luis Fernando. The issue of China-U.S. tensions is certainly an issue in Chile. First of all, the debate looks quite different in my country than it looks in Colombia and probably in Mexico, because China is Latin America is a very diverse region, and this diversity is reflected in our country's relationship with China. China is more significant to Chile, economically speaking, than it is the U.S. China is today, by far, the most important and largest trading partner of Chile. We are sending about 38–39% of our exports to China. So this is a very important issue. It is the second largest is the U.S., but it's a distant second. It is reversed in the order of Mexico and Colombia. For Colombia, their main trading partner, and Mexico, their main trading partner is the U.S., and China will be a fast-growing but distant second. So it's a kind of reversed order. Just to give you an idea, Chilean exports to China between January and September of 2021 totaled 26 billion, surpassed 26 billion, a 40% year-on-year increase. And it was more than double the amount of Mexico and Colombia exports to China combined, during the entire year 2020. And this Chilean figure that I'm giving you is even more impressive. You consider that Chile is a smaller economy than both Colombia and Mexico. And it is not just copper. So here's one big issue, copper. And a big industry with an interest in China, but it is more than copper. Last year, China surpassed the U.S. as the most important destination for Chilean non-copper exports. And the other issue, which is a difference here, is that both Mexico and Colombia run large trade deficits with China. And we run a very important trade surplus. Our trade surplus is about 2.3% of GDP. Brazil, let me just give a broader view. Brazil and Peru also are similar to Chile in the fact that they are the most important trading partner is also China. So China, for some countries in South America, have become the most important trading partner, and by a big difference. And this is different from Mexico, Central America, and Colombia, and some countries in Latin America. So there are very different views here. On investments, China has made a very important inroad from a very low base. China is starting to invest in some of our countries. In Chile, there are two very large investments on 2020 and 2021. And these investments, which are over between 2.3 and $3 billion each, in both energy deals, are only second to the kind of investments that you can look in Brazil. So we have a dual issue, trade and investment, in the relationship. And of course, as you were mentioning, it is certainly that the business community, especially export or investment-oriented sectors, tend to favor a very strong engagement with China, not to disengage with the U.S., but to engage more profoundly and more deeply with China. And the Chilean government, across different administrations, is managing one of the most open economies in the region, also favors greater engagement with China. So here we have, I think, what it is a different type of relationship between China and our economy, and the role of China vis-a-vis the U.S. We will look to other issues, so I would like to just continue. We could keep talking about this for a long time, but we will have time to talk about the relationship between, how do we deal with this relationship between China and the U.S. Thank you.
That's right. No, we've got plenty of time still, but I want to go to Luis Fernando now. And look, one of the things that we're hearing here is just the big diversity of economic and trade and geopolitical matrices that we see across countries, separated by so much space. I mean, the Mexico, kind of on the one hand, very integrated with the United States, Chile on the other hand, perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, and Colombia somewhere in the middle, because this is a country where, historically over the last 20 years, especially a very strong ally, perhaps the strongest ally geopolitically of the United States in the region, but increasingly at a trade level, getting very close to Beijing. So Luis Fernando, good morning, and perhaps you could give the Colombian view on this.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in this distinguished panel with Marta and Felipe. Thank you very much again. So yeah, you're right. Colombia is kind of in the middle of the two discussions that we just had heard from Marta and Felipe. So Colombia, as you said, probably one of the strongest allies for the U.S. in the region. And what we have seen, it's a very important increase in trade relations between Colombia and the USA and China in the past decade. So China, a couple of years ago, maybe at the beginning of the century, wasn't even in the top 30 of the most important trading partners for Colombia. And now it's the second most important partner after the US. And the rise of imports has been very, very rapid. Colombia is importing about $10 billion per year, which is about the same amount that we import from the US. Exports have not been as dynamic as exports to the US, but imports are on the same level. So I would say that when you ask the question about what's the level of discussion of the Chinese-US relationship in Colombia, I would say there are three different actors that have different discussions about this. One is the consumer side, the general population, which of course is not thinking about the big picture about the Chinese-American conflict, rising conflict. They're just seeing more and more goods coming from China at low prices, so an increase in purchasing power for most of Colombia's households. So they're happy for having that cheap access to those type of goods. So, and that the general population think, well, China has become a very important source for buying goods. So that's, to me, the view of the general consumer in Colombia. producers, it depends on whether, you know, the Chinese imports are competing with local production. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about China not being still a market economy according to the World Trade Organization. So that puts pressure in terms of organized producers in Colombia coming to the government saying, well, look, you have to protect us because China is doing some dumping. They're putting goods and services below market prices. We cannot compete with subsidies and dumping practices. So they're asking for protections. That's one side. The other side of producers are importers, which of course are very happy for getting those type of cheap goods from China. So that's the main question, I think, in the short term from the production side. And finally, a discussion from the intellectual circles, which is completely different. It's of course, it incorporates the dynamics of the recent trade growth that we have seen from China, the upcoming investments that we have seen from the Chinese government and Chinese enterprises. I mentioned in my article that, for example, the first line for the Bogota Metro, which is going to be the largest investment in the probably next 5 years in Colombia, is going to be done by a Chinese enterprise. So you see more and more of FDI and investment and financing from China for major infrastructure projects in Colombia. But there's also in this intellectual cycles a discussion about what to do. You know, what should be the stance for Colombia in terms of this rising conflict. And it's a tough question because, as you mentioned again, Colombia has been probably the closest ally for the U.S. And to me, the government has adopted, you know, a very pragmatic approach in which it continues working with the U.S. It has let you know, trade flows to increase at a very rapid pace. More recently has welcomed investment, which is different from other countries in the region. Colombia is one of the last countries that, you know, opened the door very rapidly for FDI from China. So now you see more discussion about, well, China is the second trading partner for Colombia. We have major investment coming in the next years. There are rising tensions from the U.S. and China, and you know, the country should take a stance on what to do. So these are the three themes that I'm seeing, you know, consumers, producers, and intellectual circles.
All right. Well, thank you, Luis Fernando. So look, that was great. That was the appetizer in some ways. Now let's get to the main course, which is this question of how do you think, you know, what are your thoughts on how your own country and Latin America as a whole should navigate these rising tensions? And, you know, it's interesting, all three of you have made references to the articles that you wrote for America's Quarterly, and we were very grateful for those, and they generated a lot of interest, each of them for different reasons. But all three of them, even though, you know, we had three different countries and people, you know, with different life experiences, I think it's safe to say that all of them had more or less the same central idea, which is that your own country really should not choose. That you know, it's necessary to strike a balance right now between Washington and Beijing. But I would challenge you on this. Is that, yeah, that sounds good, but do you really think it's going to be possible over the next 10 years when it comes to very specific decisions like this 5G decision that Martha mentioned? Let me start with Felipe first, and then go to Martha.
Thank you, Brian. Well, first of all, you know, I'm glad that we agreed with my fellow panelists here, and in the articles, it's clear in the three articles that we shouldn't choose sides. And choosing sides, what we have said in our article is that it's not only ill-advised, but it's also ill-timed, because regional economies who have battered, you know, were battered by the COVID-19 in the context of economic reactivation. We need to tap on all the external sources of growth and support available, whether China, the U.S., or elsewhere. So choosing will be, in this sense, as we argue, ill-advised and ill-timed. Just consider last year, Latin America had the steepest contraction of GDP, 7% of all regions of the world. There is a strong rebound for this year at about over 6%. And in 2022, it's expected something in the order of 2%. But this, implies that we won't reach the level of per capita income that we had prior to the pandemic. We won't reach it until late 2023 or 2024. So, and in other areas like employment, poverty, fiscal positions will take longer to recover than headline GDP. Inflation is also another very important issue. And this are taking actions in several countries: Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Colombia. All countries are taking action in terms of this upheaval of inflation that we're seeing. So we also need to consider the macro spillovers from the U.S. and China. This is another issue. The Fed tapering, the end of the quantitative easing, and the rate hikes may impact investor appetite towards emerging market assets, and we will be part of this trend. On the other hand, the Chinese property sector deleveraging may impact the Latin American and the Caribbean commodity export in terms of trade. My conclusion here is that working with both the US and China is important for regional recovery, both in terms of capitalizing favorable external conditions and mitigating and diversifying external risks. There are, if you push me on this one, there are some issues which I think are less zero-sum. We have some issues which are more of a zero-sum game, but for example, trade and investment is not a zero-sum game. It's really a positive sum game. And here, choosing doesn't make any sense. In other areas like technology, that is closer to a zero-sum game. For example, in 5G, what is the alternative? What is the alternative to what some of these players are offering? So as long as the US and China provide alternatives, I think there will be a reasonable way out in terms of not having to choose one side or the other, or having it in a competitive way, making choices in a very competitive way. So instead of framing the question in terms of countries choosing between the US and China, perhaps it's better framing it that we countries in Latin America, we're choosing to prioritize our own national interests, and by association, whichever external partners that are more willing or likely to support us and to be part of this better cooperation, that we can, because it's an issue in competition, but also in cooperation. Just to finish, let me say that Chile, for example, is part of the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which is a very important development bank led by China. And it has become recently a member, and also we are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we have signed the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are many ways in which you can cooperate and be open to both partners. We have a very long-standing relationship with the US. I think Fernando was mentioning that at the beginning of the 2000s, China was about the 30-something trading partner. Well, you can tell a similar story here, except that now you have almost 40% of exports going to China. So it's a pretty amazing thing what has happened over the last couple of decades here in terms of our trade relationship with China.
Martha, you come from a very different country and a different background, but I saw you, nodding a lot at what Felipe was saying. I mean, what do you agree with? What do you think is different in Mexico? Did you hear anything that you disagree with? I mean, where do you stand on this?
Thank you. Yes, I would say first that I would totally agree with what Felipe said, is that each of Latin American countries has to prioritize its own national interest. And it is not in the national interest of Mexico, neither to fight or the US nor China, because both are important partners for Mexico. In the case of trade specifically, China has become indeed our second trading partner. But China was negligible for Mexico on trading matters until the end of the last century. In 2003, our trade with China was 1% of our total trade. In 2019, was almost 10%. But it is a very unbalanced trade, more similar to Colombia, and Felipe pointed it in his first intervention. We import much more from China than we export. We import almost $90 billion US, and we export only $7 billion US. So that is a challenge that we have with China. And we have the same debate as Luis Fernando was describing between consumers and producers in Mexico on the impact of this trade and imports from China. Having said that, there's another aspect for Mexico very important. Since China joined the WTO and the end of the multi-fiber agreement or the transition, it affected Mexican producers a lot because we lost market, particularly in the US, on two very important industries then, textile and toys and plastics. So our trade relationship with China is a little bit more complex in the sense that we have a deficit trade with China. We export very little. We find a lot of protectionism in certain areas for export to China, basically on agricultural products. But China is also our main competitor in the US market sometimes. The other very interesting thing regarding trade and investment, China is not a big investor in Mexico as it is in Chile, not yet. But it won 2 tenderings for deep water exploration and production, and it has done some investment in infrastructure, although some of other projects of investment didn't went well. But what we see in the statistics, trade statistics, is that more and more China has become part of certain key supply chains in North America, basically in the automotive industry. And we see it now with the lack of chips for the automotive industry. And we saw also that North America, the US, Mexico, and Canada, we were too dependent on China on other sectors, like pharmaceuticals, like PPE, protective equipment, personal protective equipment, like chemicals. And I think this is, and I go back to the first time that I participated, this is one of the key issues. How with this nearshoring of value chains, of supply chains, will affect our not only trade relationship with China, but political relationship. And I think we will have to do a very careful job of, while increasing the competitiveness of Mexico and North America, explaining to China that it's not a policy against China, is a policy to guarantee that when we confront issues so terrible as the pandemic, we will be able to rely on ourselves, because both the India, China, and the US, they imposed export restrictions of certain equipment during COVID. You may remember that the US imposed export restrictions on PPE, on personal protective equipment. And then there was a special exception for Canada and Mexico. But these cannot happen again. So these are one of the issues that we will have to discuss. And other areas in which, for example, Mexico is much more closer to China than to the US is in the debates in multilateral fora. One very particular issue that also impacts Colombia and Chile, the debate in international financial institutions, either big ones or small ones, on how to deal with high-level middle-income countries. There is a trend of Europeans and the US to say no more loans with preferential rates to high-level middle-income countries because of GDP. And with China and with other Latin American countries, we have been fighting to say this is not correct, because there is still a lot of poverty in these high-level middle-income countries, because we have a problem of inequality, which is one of the biggest problems in Latin America, and which the pandemic really deepened the inequality in Latin America. But also, when you, for example, treat the Caribbean countries, which are also allies, with these criteria, you don't give them loans, but they can be destroyed by natural disasters and by climate change. So it is incredible, but our ally in the discussion on these matters has been China, not the US. So that is why I think that the relationship of my country, and I think in general of Latin America, with the US and China, has to be very, very well analyzed and very sophisticated, and not only remain in statistics, in trade statistics or investment. And I finally agree with Felipe that the issue of technology, it's maybe where we are going to have more difficult decisions to make. In the case of Mexico, and this is my personal opinion, I think that Mexico has little margin of maneuver for technology, because we are so economically integrated with the US that it implies that we need to have similar technologies or homogeneous technologies to guarantee the security and to guarantee that the supply chains are working properly. What we discovered in COVID-19, for example, was that Boeing had more than 57 suppliers in Mexico in 26 states, and Tesla had around 100 suppliers in Mexico at different stages or tiers. And I don't think that before the pandemic, neither people in Mexico nor in the US understood well how deeply integrated the supply chains were and how we had to take care of them. I don't think any other Latin American country has this level of integration with the US. But if we strengthen these supply chains for North America, it will be also an opportunity, after listening to Luis Fernando and to Felipe, to pull together to the magnet of North America, to pull Central America and up to Colombia. And it will make a whole geopolitical area of competitiveness. And while at the same time, China will do the same in Asia. And so this is something more in a long term. But if we first don't manage to put our act together in North America, I don't see how we can pull the rest. And then another actor that we haven't been talking about, but it shares with us some of these worries, the European Union. Because the European Union is also a very important trading partner, particularly with South America, and a very important investment partner for Mexico. I will stop here.
Thank you, Martha. Luis Fernando, let me come to you, and feel free to react to any of those points as you see fit. But let me also mix this with a question that came in from a member of the audience. And he points out, he says that this discussion right now so far has been focused on markets and on economies. Are we leaving out the more geopolitical questions, thinking about what Chinese interests and goals are, including long term? Are we ignoring Chinese behavior in places such as Africa? And it's true. We've had a very economic focused discussion so far. What do you think?
Wonderful, Brian. Yes. So first of all, your question is very challenging. We all said you don't have to choose, but you can think about scenarios where probably economies would have to choose. For example, what happens if there's a military escalation, a conflict? Well, I doubt that the region wouldn't have to choose sides. So, I mean, the self-interest of each of our economies works in normal time, but not in for example, in the case of a conflict. where my feeling is that, of course, Latin America shares more values with the U.S. than with China. So that's an issue that we have to take into account. Now, I like what Felipe mentioned. We're both economists, and the framework about thinking some issues about whether there are gains to be had or not. And one of the things that we learn in economics, which is not easy to transmit, is that in trade, the theory of competitive advantage, where you have a specialization of production of goods and services, causes gains for both partners. So trade is not a zero-sum game, as opposed to the more general geopolitical conflict, where typically power is something that you cannot share, and then you have these type of difficult decisions. Now, what should be the framework for the region and Colombia in particular? Well, one of the things that is key for deciding which side to choose, for example, in terms of technology and some other issues, is what's the best alternative that the U.S. is offering for the region. And I bring this point because I mentioned this again in my article, the point about vaccines. The U.S. was very important in vaccine diplomacy, but later in the game, and China was very effective in providing much needed vaccines to the region when the marginal benefit of those vaccines were the highest at the beginning of this year. And for example, in March, we had about 70% of vaccines coming from China. And that, of course, helped a lot in preventing further death. So I had a small discussion a couple of weeks ago about the worries that some U.S. government officials had with of why Colombia was opening up discussions with China about setting up a laboratory that could produce Sinovac vaccines in Colombia. And they were saying, why are you guys doing this? And my response was, well, what's the alternative, right? I mean, is the U.S. offering to build a Pfizer production laboratory in Colombia? If not, well, countries have to, think about their needs. We are in the middle of recovery of a huge crisis. We need vaccines. We need employment. So of course, economic decisions are on the top of the agenda. And the other example for this framework about the best alternative is what Felipe was mentioning about the Belt and Road Initiative that China launched 8 years ago. And you see that the US took exactly 8 years to respond to that very important, ambitious initiative. Colombia, unfortunately, has not signed for that. Chile, as Felipe mentioned, has already done so. But it's very important in this type of relationship, the US, China, and Latin America, that both countries think about the long term and offer alternatives that are quick and efficient for the needs of the country. So vaccines is one example. The new Build Back Better World initiative that the US is launching is very important for counterbalancing the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would say that that opportunity cost of taking decisions is very key for adopting one or the other side in this type of particular issues like technology and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the more general question that you mentioned at the end, Brian, of course, we have not discussed the more geopolitical issues that are more long-term about the growing influence of China, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America, which has also become not only a source of trade, but also an important source of investment, not only through direct investment from the government, but also, again, as Felipe mentioned, through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So I would say that, you see clearly a very long-term strategy for China of having more influence in terms of trade, investment, geopolitical power for the region. And I'm sure that the US is not going to, stand around, see everything unfold. And that's why you see this type of reactions, for example, the Build Back Better World initiative.
Thank you, Luis Fernando. And just a reminder that those of you who are watching on WebEx can send in questions to the host using the chat function. Those of you watching us on live stream or Twitter, there are tools where you can do it there, and we have people who are trying to monitor those platforms as well. Luis Fernando, let me stick with you and then send it around to everybody else. You mentioned the Washington piece of this and this question of what's the alternative, which I think is a question that I certainly hear a lot in these conversations. Martha, you mentioned the idea of kind of an America's wide, more integrated area on trade over the long term. But in practice, these ideas they've I think it's fair to say they've been struggling a bit. We have, and I'm being diplomatic here, in Washington right now, there's really not consensus in either party when it comes to trade deals. This administration, the Biden administration, has been trying to have dialogue with countries, including Brazil, where the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the point person at the White House on Latin America issues, Juan Gonzalez, recently traveled down there. 5G and China was one of the big, if not the main subject on the table in that discussion. My question is, given kind of the limitations on Washington right now, because of domestic politics, because of other concerns, what advice would you give to this government, the people in this administration, as they try to, basically keep Latin America close? Luis Fernando, starting with you.
Well, Brian, I would further emphasize the need of, the opportunity for offering quick and efficient alternatives. And the technology is a great example, because once you take the decision about which technology to adopt, you're going to have that decision for many years. It's not easy to change the infrastructure investment for technology if you choose the Chinese 5G technology from the U.S. or an European technology. So there's a sense of opportunity and urgency about these type of decisions, where it's not only about claiming that, of course, the U.S. and the region have very strong relationships for many decades. Is again thinking about what could the U.S. government offer that is a better or equal alternative from what the Chinese are offering, and I would emphasize that, and that applies to technology, that applies to vaccines, which is a thing that's going to be, we know that this pandemic hasn't ended, and we're going to have further rounds of vaccinations for the next few years to prevent further contagions and deaths. So that's another issue that I think the U.S. should definitely tackle. What could the U.S. provide as an alternative instead of Brazil and Colombia building Sinovac laboratory vaccines in their countries? So the opportunity, the urgency of this type of decisions, I think is key, because again, once the investment is done, it's very hard to change what the decision was once the decision was made. In terms of investment, I think the U.S. has approached this a little bit late, but now has taken again the upper hand. Hopefully, you see that there were high government officials visiting Mexico, Colombia, and other countries in the region, and saying, well, we have the Build Back Better World initiative, which has many $40 trillion for closing infrastructure gaps in the developing world. Now, it's key from moving from announcements to actually investments. We see that there's these huge claims of $40 trillion to invest, but the needs for the region are for now. We are recovering from a very huge crisis. We have high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty not seen almost 10 years ago. So the fastest you can get with that money to the region, well, the better you'll build this confidence between the region and the willingness of the U.S. to provide much needed help. And that would, tend, of course, countries to move towards the U.S. side. So opportunity, urgency, and implementation of plans, I think, are key in terms of the needs for Washington to keep Latin America close.
Felipe, the same question for you, but with this proviso. I mean, people in Washington tell you, yes, it would be great to put together a big investment plan, with a lot of money for the region right now. But you look at the price tag on some of these domestic initiatives that we're already doing here in the United States right now, and it's clear that just because of domestic political conditions, there's just not a lot of money there. So in the absence of a big, people talk sometimes about a Marshall Plan. That's off the table. But what do you see as sort of the best steps for people in DC?
Well, first thing here is that I would agree that there needs to be, with Fernando, I also mentioned it, the idea of an alternative, providing alternatives, because otherwise we will have to take in Latin America what is available to support our recoveries and getting back to the normalcy. Let me just point to a couple of issues that I think are important. Engaging more on trade, I take your point, Brian, that maybe there is not a big appetite for increased trade integration in the U.S. But for example, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the U.S. walked out from the Trans-Pacific, from TPP, and now China is trying to join the CPTPP, so the successor of the TPP. So the point here is that if the U.S. walks away, there is someone that is willing to come in, and take the role. So I would suggest to take a closer look. It's not a big issue to be. I think it's not a very big issue in terms of it doesn't have a price tag as a huge Marshall Plan would have. And joining and rejoining CPTPP would be very important. Otherwise, we may have that CPTPP will have China and will not have the US. And this is right now there are 11 countries which are part of the CPTPP, and several of them in Latin America. And we will have to see. That's one issue. The other is, I would say, cooperation on climate action. Climate action is a very important area, and some of it may be financial, but some of it may be about the commitments that we make, coming out of Glasgow, coming out of COP26, the idea that we should take this action if we want to have, the 2 degrees, by the end of the century, that limit the increase in world average temperatures, below 2 degrees. We need to take action, and here is full area for cooperation. And I think in terms of the health is another important area for cooperation. Right now, and I will take the view from my own country, we've had, because that's what we could do and what was available at the time, most of the vaccination has happened with Chinese vaccines, here. We've had some Pfizer, but most of it has been Sinovac. Some Pfizer, some AstraZeneca, but most of it Sinovac. And now we have around 80% of the population with a full dose, in Chile. Moreover, now there are plans to establish the manufacturing of vaccines in our country. I heard that same thing in other of the countries here under discussion. So I think those are areas where I think we can, certainly cooperate, and we can have a broader engagement in the absence of a big infrastructure plan for the region, because we understand that the domestic pressure on resources, is huge. But that doesn't mean that there are not other areas of cooperation. So I would strongly urge to look into this. And in the end, the issue, on my view, is not ideological. The issue is really much more pragmatic, and in a pragmatic way, there is a lot of areas of mutual interests to explore. I've mentioned 3 or 4 of them.
Thank you, Felipe.
Can I jump in and make a little comment about what Felipe just mentioned?
Yeah, just quickly. I want to go to Martha after that, but just quick note.
Understanding that in the short term, there's probably not much space for infrastructure investment, I would say that signal of what's the path for this 40 trillion that the U.S. is committing for closing the infrastructure gap is key, because otherwise it's just an announcement. And if you say, well, we cannot provide this in the short term, but in a period of 10, 15 years, we're gonna have this type of availability of funds, that would be key for, again, complementing the needs for the infrastructure investments in the region. That's all I want to add.
Thank you. Martha, you may know Washington better than anybody here. You were recently an ambassador there. I mean, what's your sense on these questions? What's possible, what's viable, and what would you advise?
Well, I think my answer will have different dimensions. First is that I understand that this Build Back Better initiative is basically related for the US, as was the bill for infrastructure. It's basically for investment in the US. Not, I have not seen it all, but I don't think it includes a huge chapter of investments abroad. What the US administration is doing is using the concept of Build Back Better to put it in all press communiques of all the fora in which they attend. They are using the concept. As far as I understand, they are not committing resources. Please, maybe you can clarify these later on, Brian. So I think the US now has a lot of domestic challenges. They passed the infrastructure bill. They haven't passed the Build Better alternative, which is more oriented also to social programs. And in that, and then they have the budget, which it is related to this other bill of social spending. And why do I mention the budget? Because in the budget reconciliation process, they were trying to include, the Democrats, some aspects that can be beneficial for Latin Americans in general, and maybe particularly for Mexicans, which are related to immigration, which is some kind of regularization of dreamers, of citizens with TPS, with temporary protection status, and with the so-called essential workers, particularly in the agricultural sector. So if this happens, it will be very well received in several Latin American countries. The second challenge that we have ahead is that the US will be host of the Summit of the Americas in 2022. And as far as I understand, everybody's talking about how to focus the summit in which areas, and what could be the deliverables of this summit. I think the summit offers the opportunity for the Biden-Harris administration to present these alternative, pragmatic alternatives that both Luis Fernando and Felipe have been referring to. Which are the alternatives and pragmatic? I don't know. I am afraid that recognizing the relevance of democracy and human rights in the continent, that we have to recognize it. If the Summit of the Americas is focused on these, it will be a very difficult summit with very few results. But if you manage to focus the summit on some of the areas in which Felipe and Luis Fernando were mentioning, infrastructure investment, health, the harmonization of health measures, of having production facilities of vaccines in our countries, and not only of vaccines, but of therapeutics now announced by Pfizer. If you focus on how are we going to deal with climate action, and if you focus on how is the US going to interact in Canada with Latin America and the Caribbean in recovering from COVID-19, which created so many poors that, and we just went back so many years on fighting poverty and on inequality. And as Felipe said at the beginning, we will have the levels of the economic pre-pandemic levels maybe in 2024, 2023. So I would recommend the American government Congress establishment is focused on presenting in the Summit of the Americas, which is April or May, these very concrete cooperation areas. Very concrete cooperation areas in fighting inequality, in fighting poverty, in guaranteeing better health, in collaborating in climate change. And then really commit your position that you will not be fighting the loans towards high-level middle-income countries, which is basically all Latin American and Caribbean, and that you will do the replenishment of the IDB resources, and to focus the IDB on these alternative options that are very practical. Maybe I'm too policy oriented, but
no. I mean, those were very.
I would work for the immediate future.
Those were very specific ideas, and I thank you for them. And look, we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to give each of our panelists like a minute or so to make any final remarks. But let me try my best to kind of synthesize what I feel like I've heard today. I mean, what I'm hearing is that in most of your countries, the focus really is on this post-pandemic economic recovery. And at the same time, you know, Beijing, despite its own domestic problems in the real estate sector and elsewhere, it continues to expand trade flows, certainly investment. They've been fairly effective on the vaccine diplomacy front, as Luis Fernando noted. The United States, meanwhile, distracted by its own post-COVID recovery, some of these domestic issues, polarization, the increasing realization that the era of kind of this big spending is over, which makes putting forward an alternative, like Luis Fernando mentioned, very difficult. So what it sounds like to me, what we're likely to see is kind of this continued posture from within the region of at least an attempt at non-alignment, right? Of maybe leaning toward China on issues like 5G, but not making really strong commitments. And that this kind of this non-aligned posture of trying to bridge the gap between these two countries is likely to continue until we see some sort of major change, right? Whether that's Luis Fernando mentioned Taiwan, perhaps a change in political conditions here in the United States, where you see a different administration or a new attitude towards trade. I mean, that's my own thoughts based on kind of what I've heard from you. Let me now give each of you again just a minute or so to wrap up, and maybe starting Felipe with you.
Well, thank you, Brian. This has been a very important opportunity to exchange ideas on these very important issues. Yesterday, we had a high-level meeting between Presidents Xi and Biden. And that high-level meeting, although it didn't get to very concrete issues, it highlighted the importance of cooperation. And the two parties, let me just say, for example, quote President Biden said, "Our responsibility is that competition between the U.S. and China does not lead to conflict." And President Xi said, "China-U.S. should respect each other and cooperate in areas of mutual benefit." And he also said, "I'm ready to work with you, President Biden, and build consensus." So I think we can find ways in which the conflict does not escalate. And we hope that the cooperation will prevail. And it's good to have competition, but competition channeled within a cooperative way, as we compete with each other in Latin America, but we compete in a cooperative way. So that's one thing on the global sphere. On us, I think there are huge opportunities to expand our trade ties, our investment ties, and cooperation well beyond that on health, on climate action, on issues like infrastructure that are so important for our region. And I think we will not have to choose. So we will, in essence, be open to alternatives, to opportunities on both sides, and then and things that could be of mutual benefit, cooperate with both China and the U.S. And I think that will be my take.
Thank you, Felipe. Martha, just quickly, any final thoughts?
Yes, I think I will agree that a confrontation between the US and China in Latin America will not help anyone. And I think the key is cooperation, understanding that it will be under the umbrella of competition, and that we have to focus in very concrete areas in which we can work both with the US and with China. And I basically think that we really have to focus on this inequality, poverty, and the economic recovery of Latin America. And in that sense, a lot of people in Latin America think that in fighting poverty and inequality, China has been more successful in recent years than the US. And I think the Biden administration has acknowledged the problems that the US itself has on inequality. And it's the time for the US then to engage in this conversation with Latin America and to go forward, and not only on emphasizing the competition or the confrontation with China.
All right, thank you. And Luis Fernando, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Marta and Felipe, for this wonderful conversation. Well, I would just say that we're probably in a turning point in terms of this relationship between the Latin American region, the US and China. As Marta just mentioned, China has been probably relatively more successful in terms of increasing trade, in terms of increasing investment, and in terms of vaccine diplomacy, as I mentioned during my previous intervention. And this turning point, again, opens up the opportunities for the US to offer urgent and efficient alternatives to the much needed infrastructure and social and climate change needs for the region. So I would emphasize again the importance of putting more concrete things on the table. Marta was mentioning the Build Back Better initiative in the US. That's a different chapter from the B3W announcement that the US made in June of this year alongside G7 countries. We have not heard since June for any other specific figures about this $40 trillion claim of investment. We don't know how many years, we don't know what the specific sources are. So again, there's a sense of urgency in terms of providing quick, efficient alternatives so that we can further build and strengthen our relationship between the US and the region.
Luis Fernando, Martha, Felipe, thank you. This was one of those events where I felt like really we could have done the entire hour with just one of you. But thank you to all of you for for your thoughts on this complex issue. Thank you again to Florida International University for your sponsorship. I would direct everyone watching to go find the articles that each of these people wrote for America's Quarterly, in which they expand on some of their thoughts. And great chat. I mean, this is the topic right now for so many people, and I was grateful to have such an amazing panel here for this. So thank you to all of you, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Brian, Luis Fernando, Martha.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to join all of you.